I went camping alone in late October of 2021 because I needed distance from everything that had been building in my life. I had been working long hours at a warehouse outside the city, lifting and loading crates until my hands stayed sore even on my days off. My sleep had turned shallow and restless. I woke up feeling tight in my chest. I stopped enjoying anything. Camping had always been the one place where my mind slowed down. I chose a remote forest area I had visited once before, about 4 hours from my apartment, deep inside a national forest where cell service faded long before the tree line thickened. The drive there took most of the day. The road narrowed after the last gas station. Asphalt turned to cracked pavement, then to gravel. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches crossing overhead and blocking most of the sky. By the time I reached the trailhead parking area, the sun had started lowering behind the ridge. The lot was empty except for an old metal sign and a rusted trash barrel. I parked near the edge, shut off the engine, and listened. The silence felt heavy. No distant cars, no voices, only the faint movement of wind pushing through dry leaves high above. The air smelled clean and cold, with a hint of pine sap and damp soil. I loaded my pack and started walking down the trail. The path stretched ahead in a narrow strip of compact dirt, winding between thick trunks and exposed roots. My boots pressed into the ground with dull, steady sounds. Fallen leaves shifted under each step. The deeper I walked, the darker it became, even though sunset had not finished yet. The forest blocked most of the remaining light. I reached the clearing I remembered just before dusk settled in fully. It sat beside a small creek that cut through smooth stones and shallow bends. The water moved slowly, barely making noise. The clearing had enough flat space for a tent and a fire pit made of old stones left by previous campers. I dropped my pack and stood still, breathing in the air. My chest loosened. My shoulders relaxed. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, facing the trees. I gathered dry wood scattered around the ground and built a small fire inside the ring of stones. The flames rose slowly, crackling and sending sparks upward. The light flickered across the trunks and branches, creating uneven shadows that shifted constantly. I ate a simple meal from a small metal container and sat on a folded pad near the fire. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. Cold air settled into the clearing. The warmth from the fire only reached a few feet. I stayed awake longer than usual, staring into the flames, listening to the forest. At first, the sounds felt normal. Leaves falling, occasional branches creaking, water moving through the creek. Then I noticed something that did not match the rest. Footsteps. Slow, light, careful. I froze and listened harder. The sound came from somewhere beyond the clearing, inside the trees. It was faint, almost blending into the natural noise, but it followed a pattern. Weight pressing into leaves. A pause. Another step. I stayed still for several minutes, trying to convince myself it was an animal. Deer moved through forests quietly. Small animals shifted constantly at night. The steps stopped. The silence returned. I forced myself to relax. I added another piece of wood to the fire and watched it catch flame. After some time, I crawled into my tent and zipped it closed. The fire burned low outside, casting dim light through the fabric walls. I lay on my back inside my sleeping bag, staring upward. Sleep came slowly. At some point during the night, I woke without knowing why. My body stayed still, but my senses sharpened. I listened. There was again. Footsteps. Closer this time. Not random. Not wandering. Moving in a slow circle. Around the clearing. Dry leaves compressed under careful weight. A pause followed each step, as if whoever made the sound wanted to stay quiet. My heart started beating harder. I did not move. I did not make noise. The fire had died completely. Darkness filled the clearing. The footsteps continued for several minutes, then stopped. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening, waiting, unable to rest. Morning arrived slowly. Gray light filtered through the tent walls. The cold had deepened overnight. My breath formed faint clouds inside the tent. I unzipped the entrance and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal. Nothing disturbed the ground at first glance. The creek flowed quietly. The trees stood still. I walked carefully around the edge of the clearing, scanning the ground. That was when I saw the footprints. They were faint but clear enough in the thin layer of leaves and soft soil. Boot prints, not animal tracks. Human. They circled the entire clearing. They passed within 10 feet of my tent. My stomach tightened. I followed the prints with my eyes. They came from deeper in the forest and returned in the same direction. I stood there for a long time, thinking this area was remote. The trailhead had been empty. I had not seen anyone on the hike in. Someone had walked into my campsite during the night and circled it slowly while I slept. I packed slowly, considering whether to leave. Part of me wanted to stay and prove to myself that it had been harmless. Another part felt exposed. I decided to stay one more night. I spent the day walking along the creek, trying to calm my mind. The forest looked peaceful in daylight. Sunlight reached through the branches in narrow beams. Birds moved between limbs. The sounds felt normal again, but the feeling stayed inside me. Late in the afternoon, I found something else. About 50 yards from a clearing, hidden behind thick brush, sat a structure. It was small and low, made from branches and a torn plastic tarp. The shape blended into the surroundings. I almost walked past it without noticing. I approached slowly. The tarp had been stretched over a simple frame of sticks. Beneath it lay objects arranged in a way that showed regular use. Empty food cans, plastic bottles, a worn blanket, a metal knife. This was not abandoned. Someone lived there. I backed away slowly, my breathing shallow. The footsteps, the circling. It made sense now. Whoever lived here had been watching me. I returned to my clearing and packed most of my gear, leaving only the tent. I planned to leave early the next morning. I stayed alert through the evening, feeding the fire more wood than before to keep the area bright. Night fell again. The forest grew quiet. I stayed awake inside the tent, listening. Hours passed. Then I heard it. Footsteps, closer than before, slower. They stopped directly beside my tent. I could hear breathing, low, controlled. The sound stayed there for a long time. I held my breath, every muscle locked in place. The shape outside blocked faint starlight against the tent wall. A hand pressed lightly against the fabric. The material pushed inward slightly. The pressure stayed for several seconds. Then it released. The footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I did not sleep at all that night. At first light, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook. My body felt weak from lack of rest. I left the clearing and followed the trail back to the parking area without stopping. When I reached my car, I felt relief stronger than anything I'd felt in months. As I opened the driver's door, I saw something that made my stomach drop again. Mud streaks marked the side of my vehicle. Handprints. They were smeared along the rear door and window. Someone had touched my car during the night. They had followed me all the way to the trailhead. I drove away immediately, checking the mirrors constantly. Later, after reaching home, I researched the area. I found reports from hikers who had seen signs of someone living deep inside that section of forest. They described hidden shelters and stolen food. Some reported being watched at night. Forest rangers suspected a long-term transient who avoided contact and stayed hidden. They warned visitors to avoid camping alone in that region. Everything matched what I experienced. The person had not attacked me. They had not spoken. They had only watched, circled, observed. I realized how vulnerable I had been. Thin fabric separated me from someone who lived silently in the woods and moved without sound. I never returned to that forest. Even now, years later, I still remember the shape of that hand pressing against the tent wall and the slow footsteps moving through leaves in the dark, close enough to reach me whenever they wanted. I went camping because I did not know what else to do with myself after my dad died. The house felt wrong without him in it. His chair stayed pushed back from the table the way he had left it. His boots stayed near the door. I found myself avoiding certain rooms because they held too much of him. Camping had always been the one place where things made sense between us. It was where he had taught me how to build a fire without paper, how to listen to wind moving through trees, how to recognize distance and sound. I wanted to feel that again. I wanted something familiar that did not remind me of hospitals, paperwork, and quiet rooms. I chose a dry, open area in the foothills about 2 hours from my town. It was a place we had visited several times when I was younger. I remembered the wide stretches of pale dirt and scattered rock, the low scrub bushes, and the long view of the hills fading into the horizon. It was not crowded. Most people avoided it because there was no water source and no shade except for the occasional twisted tree. I arrived late in the afternoon. The air was warm but not unbearable. The ground was cracked and dry under my boots. Dust clung to everything. When I walked, it rose in faint clouds around my feet and settled on my pant legs. I parked near a small clearing and carried my gear about 50 yards away. I did the way my dad had taught me, making sure I was not directly visible from the road. I chose a flat patch of ground surrounded by low rocks. The soil there was compact and hard. Setting up the tent felt automatic. My hands remembered each motion even though years had passed since I last did it regularly. The fabric stretched tight. The stakes went in solid. The zipper moved cleanly. By the time I finished, the sun was already dropping. The sky turned a dull orange, then faded into gray. The temperature dropped fast. The heat left the ground and the air became still. I built a small fire, more for the comfort of it than the warmth. The flames moved low and steady. I sat in front of it and watched the wood collapse inward as it burned. I kept thinking about how many nights I had sat like that with him. The memory felt close but unreachable, like something I could see but not touch. After the fire died down, I crawled into the tent. The inside smelled faintly of nylon and dust. The ground beneath me felt firm through the sleeping pad. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling of the tent. I checked my phone. It was 1:14 a.m. I did not remember falling asleep, but I must have. My body felt heavy and dull. My thoughts moved slowly. That was when I heard rocks shifting outside. It was a small sound, subtle, the scrape of stone against stone. My body tensed without thinking. I stayed still and listened. The sound did not repeat. After a few seconds, I reached forward and unzipped the tent slightly. The zipper teeth separated with a soft, dry sound. I opened it just enough to see outside. The ground looked empty, pale and still under the faint moonlight. There was no movement, no shadow, no shape. The air felt calm. I waited for several seconds, scanning the area. Nothing changed. I closed the zipper and lay back down. My heart slowed after a while. My body relaxed again. I do not remember falling asleep. The next thing I knew, light was pressing through the tent walls. The color had shifted from dark gray to pale yellow. I opened my eyes slowly. My head felt heavy, like I had slept too deeply. I reached for my phone and looked at the screen. It was 6:48 a.m. For a moment, everything felt normal. My mind was empty and calm. Then I noticed my boots. They were sitting near the entrance of the tent where I had left them. But they did not look the same. They were covered in dust. Not just the light coating from the day before. The dust was thicker. It clung to the sides and filled the seams. The soles were packed with it. I stared at them for a long time. I had cleaned them before coming. I always did that before trips. I leaned forward and picked one up. The dust rubbed off onto my fingers. My chest tightened. I looked down at my feet. They were dirty, not just slightly. Dust covered my toes and the bottoms of my feet. It had settled into the lines of my skin. My heels were darker. I froze. I had gone to sleep wearing socks. The socks were lying beside me now, loose and twisted. I did not remember taking them off. I did not remember putting on my boots. I did not remember leaving the tent. I stayed there for several minutes, trying to force myself to remember anything. There was nothing, only a blank space between 1:14 a.m. and the morning light. My breathing became shallow. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside carefully. The air felt cold against my skin. The ground around the tent showed clear footprints. My footprints. They circled away from the tent and moved across the open dirt. I followed them slowly. They led away in a loose, uneven line. The spacing was irregular, sometimes close together, sometimes farther apart. They stretched toward a low rise about 50 yards away. My stomach tightened as I walked. The dust shifted under my feet in the same way. Each step left a clear impression. I reached the rise and stopped. The ground there was scuffed. Marks overlapped in several places, like I had stood there and moved around. I looked out from that spot. The view stretched wide and open. The hills were visible in the distance. It was the same view my dad had shown me years ago. I remembered standing there as a kid, feeling small and quiet. I felt something twist inside my chest. I looked down again. The footprints turned and led back toward the tent. Nothing else interrupted them. No animal tracks. No other person's steps. Only mine. I returned to the tent and stood there for a long time. I checked inside. My headlamp was no longer where I had left it. It sat near the door instead of beside my pillow. I turned it on. The battery indicator showed it had been used. I checked my phone again. The battery percentage was lower than it should have been. I opened the health app without thinking. I had never paid attention to it before. It showed steps recorded between 1:30 a.m. and 2:12 a.m. Several hundred steps. My hands began to shake. I sat down slowly on the ground outside the tent. A memory surfaced then. Not clear, not complete, just a sensation. Standing, cold air, movement, no thoughts, only motion. I had a history of sleepwalking when I was younger. It had stopped when I became a teenager. My dad used to check on me during trips because of it. He made sure I stayed safe. I had not thought about it in years. Grief had hollowed me out. The past few weeks have been filled with stress, exhaustion, and long stretches without proper sleep. My brain had slipped back into something old. I looked at my feet again. Dust filled every line. I followed the footprints once more, this time paying attention to the distance and direction. They were steady, not frantic, not random. They led directly to that overlook and back. No detours, no signs of panic, only a quiet walk in the dark. Something about that felt heavier than fear. It felt intentional, even though I had no awareness of it. I packed my gear slowly. My hands moved without energy. The tent came down. The stakes came free. Dust clung to everything. Before leaving, I walked to the rise one last time while fully awake. The view looked smaller now, less powerful. It was just land and distance. But during the night, some part of me had gone there without permission from the rest of me. Some part that still remembered standing there with him. Some part that wanted to return. I understood then that there had been no intruder, no threat outside the tent. The sound of rocks had likely been my own movement as I stepped out. I had been the one walking in the dark. The realization stayed with me as I drove home. Grief had pulled me somewhere I could not consciously reach. My body had followed an old path without asking, and the dust on my boots was proof of it. I had been camping alone in the mountains for a few days, seeking a kind of quiet that city life never allowed. I picked a small clearing off the main trail, where the ground was flat and the trees circled the site without closing in completely. The air smelled of wet pine needles and soil, the kind of damp that clings to clothing and hair without warning. I set up my tent late in the afternoon, just as the sun was slipping behind the ridges, and I spent the evening gathering firewood, careful to stack it drying off the ground. I didn't like wasting matches, and the thought of fire dying because of damp would make me uneasy. By nightfall, the small blaze I built cast long, flickering shadows across the clearing. I ate my simple meal of canned beans and crackers, listening to the occasional rustle in the trees, which I assumed were deer or the wind shaking loose dead branches. I felt safe enough. I wasn't deep in the wilderness, but far enough from the trail to be alone. I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, letting the walls sag slightly with my weight as I settled. The night was silent in a way that pressed against your ears, every small sound amplified, yet somehow muffled under the thick canopy of trees. I could hear the distant rush of a stream and the occasional thump of a falling branch somewhere in the shadows. I closed my eyes, expecting sleep to come quickly, but it was slow. My body was tired, but my mind stayed alert, noticing every whisper of wind, every distant cracking sound, every animal call that rose and fell unevenly. I must have dozed lightly, because the moment I realized I wasn't asleep, I also realized I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, the sleeping bag heavy against me, my limbs unresponsive. At first, I thought I was dreaming or in that half-conscious state where your mind wakes before your body. But then I felt it pressure, slow and deliberate on the top of the tent. Not the way a branch might fall. Not the brush of a deer stepping onto the fabric. It was weight, solid, pressing down steadily, like someone had placed themselves deliberately on the roof of the tent. My chest tightened. My lungs struggled for space, and panic started to build, but the paralysis kept me pinned. The pressure shifted slightly, imperceptibly at first, then with more clarity, as if the weight was adjusting its stance. I could feel the slight give and pull of the tent poles beneath it. I did not hear footsteps, no gravel crunching, no leaves breaking, nothing that would indicate someone climbing the ridge above me or approaching from the trail. Just weight, and the sound of my own shallow breathing magnified in the confined space. It stayed there. I don't know how long, maybe a minute, maybe two, but each second stretched endlessly. My mind ran through possibilities, trying to explain what could be there. A branch fallen perfectly on top, an animal somehow managing to press down without moving. I tried to push my body, willing my limbs to respond, but there was nothing, only the slow, shifting pressure. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it lifted. I felt the tent floor beneath me sag slightly as the weight left, a subtle rebound that confirmed it hadn't been a branch. My muscles surged back to life. I rolled out of the sleeping bag, my hands shaking as I grabbed the small flashlight on the floor of the tent. I swept the beam across the clearing. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbed dirt, no bent branches. The ground was as I had left it. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their shadows still long and irregular under the moonlight. I stayed in the tent for what felt like hours listening. My ears were attuned to everything. The soft sigh of wind through needles, the distant calls of nocturnal birds, the occasional scurry of small mammals in the underbrush. Nothing approached, nothing left. The quiet was complete, almost suffocating, and yet there was no evidence, no trace of the presence I had felt. I kept my fire going after that, though I hadn't intended to wake again. I built it higher than before, letting the flames crackle and spit light across the clearing. Every shadow in the trees seemed alive, though when I trained the flashlight, it was always empty. I walked the perimeter, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet, but found nothing unusual. No tracks, no droppings, no broken branches. Just the forest as it had always been, indifferent. Sleep did not return that night. I lay awake, watching the fire die down to embers, my body tense, ready to move at the first sign of pressure again. When dawn finally came, it was a relief to see the sun rise between the ridges, turning the mist in the valleys into a golden haze. I packed up quickly, leaving behind the fire and the small clearing, feeling the weight of the night still pressing in my chest. I never saw what had pressed on my tent. I never found anything to explain it, but I know what I felt. I know how it pinned me, the way it shifted ever so slightly, deliberate but silent. I think about that night every time I camp alone, every time I set up a tent. I trust the forest, the animals, the wind, but I will never forget the moment I woke up unable to move, the heavy weight above me, and the slow, impossible lift that left no trace behind. That weight stayed with me longer than any fear, more real than anything I could rationalize, and even now, I cannot fully explain it. September 2020 had already started to turn cold in the mountains, and the air carried that dry, clean smell that only exists when summer is ending. My girlfriend and I had driven most of the day to reach Banff National Park, following long stretches of highway that cut through valleys surrounded by steep slopes and dark forests. The drive itself had been quiet. The argument had started over something small, something that did not matter enough to remember later, but it stayed between us like pressure trapped in a sealed space. By the time we reached the campground and set up the tent, the tension had settled into silence. The campground was not crowded. Travel restrictions earlier that year had changed everything. Fewer tourists, fewer vehicles, fewer people moving between sites. The spaces around us felt open and exposed. There were other campers somewhere down the road, but none close enough to hear or see clearly. Trees surrounded the clearing in every direction. Tall lodgepole pines stood straight and narrow, spaced unevenly, their trunks pale gray under fading daylight. By 9:50 p.m., darkness had settled fully. The fire in front of me burned low, reduced to glowing coals and thin flames that moved in slow waves. My girlfriend stayed inside the tent. The zipper had closed minutes earlier. I remained outside, sitting on a folding chair, staring into the fire without thinking about anything specific. The cold had begun to move in. It crept through my jacket and settled into my arms and legs. The only sounds came from the fire itself and the occasional shift of branches high above, where wind passed through the canopy. The campground road behind us remained empty. No headlights appeared. No footsteps. No human noise. I noticed it without realizing I had been looking for anything. At the edge of the trees, where the firelight faded into darkness, something vertical stood between two trunks. It blended with the forest at first. My brain did not recognize it immediately. It was too thin to be a person and too tall to be anything else I expected to see. I leaned forward slightly, narrowing my focus. The shape did not move. It stood in place, darker than the surrounding shadows, its outline barely distinguishable from the trees behind it. The fire shifted, and the light changed with it. For a moment, the shape seemed to disappear. Then the flame rose again, and it was still there. I told myself it was a tree. There were dozens of trees at the edge of the clearing. Some were dead, stripped of branches, reduced to narrow trunks that reached upward like poles. It made sense that one of them would stand at an angle that caught the firelight differently. I watched it anyway. Minutes passed without movement. The fire cracked softly as resin pockets inside the wood heated and split. Sparks rose and disappeared into darkness. The shape remained still. I leaned back in the chair, trying to relax. I looked away for a moment, scanning the rest of the clearing, then returned my attention to the same spot. The shape had shifted. It had not walked. It had not stepped forward or backward. It had simply repositioned itself, now partially aligned with a different tree. The change was small, but it was clear. My body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders tightened, and I became aware of my breathing. I stayed still, watching. It remained motionless again. The firelight flickered, bending and stretching shadows across the ground. The trees seemed to move even when they did not. I focused on the exact edges of the shape, trying to understand what I was seeing. Another small shift. Not a step, not the natural sway of a tree in wind. It was controlled, precise. The shape slid behind a nearby trunk. It did not cross the open space between trees. It did not emerge on the other side in a visible path. It simply disappeared behind one trunk and aligned itself perfectly with it, as if it had stepped sideways rather than forward. I sat completely still. My ears picked up the faintest sound, a soft compression of ground, not the light, irregular movement of an animal. Something heavier, slower. I listened harder, holding my breath. Nothing followed. The forest returned to silence. I tried to convince myself it was an illusion. Firelight was unstable. It distorted depth and distance. It created movement where none existed. I added another piece of wood to the fire, extending my arm carefully. The flames grew brighter for a moment, throwing stronger light toward the tree line. The shape did not reappear. I waited. Seconds stretched longer than they should have. I felt exposed sitting there. The clearing, which had felt calm earlier, now felt open in a different way. The darkness beyond the fire seemed deeper. I scanned the area slowly, checking each tree. Nothing moved. Eventually, I stood and stepped backward toward the tent. The ground beneath my boots felt louder than it should have. Each shift of gravel and dirt seemed amplified. I paused before reaching the tent, turning one last time toward the edge of the forest. For a brief second, I saw it again. Not directly in front of me, off to the side, slightly farther down the tree line. The same tall, narrow shape. Still, watching. It blended perfectly with the trunk beside it. Only the faint difference in darkness separated it from the tree. I went inside the tent without looking back again. Sleep did not come easily. Every sound outside carried weight. The wind brushing branches, The settling of wood in the fire, the distant call of something moving through the forest far beyond the campsite. Morning came slowly. Light filtered through the tent walls in dull gray tones. My girlfriend packed her belongings quietly. I did the same. Neither of us addressed the night. The fire had burned out completely, leaving cold ash and blackened wood. I walked toward the edge of the clearing while she continued packing. The ground there showed clear impressions. Boot prints. They were fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by moisture or wind. They moved parallel to the clearing, staying just inside the trees. I followed them carefully. The prints never entered the open space. They remained behind cover, moving from tree to tree. In several places, the ground showed signs of someone pausing. The dirt had compressed more deeply. Pine needles were disturbed. At one point, near the exact spot where I had seen the shape disappear behind a trunk, the bark on the tree showed a faint scuff at shoulder height. The outer layer had been rubbed away slightly, exposing lighter wood beneath. Nearby, in the grass, I found a cigarette butt. The paper was damp from morning moisture, but it had not been there long. It had not collected dirt or debris. The boot prints continued farther down the tree line, then turned away in a thicker forest. Whoever had been there had stayed hidden the entire time. They had stood in positions where the firelight would outline them only faintly. They had moved sideways to keep trees between us, never stepping into open view. Later, as we drove out of the campground, I stopped briefly near the entrance where information boards stood. Printed notices covered the surface. Most were warnings about wildlife, food storage, and fire safety. One smaller notice mentioned unauthorized camping and increased patrols due to individuals living in the park without permits. Economic disruptions earlier that year had forced some people into situations where they stayed in remote areas to avoid attention. The description explained enough. Someone had been there. Not an animal, not a trick of light. A person. They had watched from a distance, using the trees for cover, repositioning carefully to stay hidden. From my angle, their sideways movements had appeared unnatural, but they had simply been stepping laterally while keeping the trunk between themselves and the fire. They had never approached directly. They had never entered the clearing. They had observed, waited, and left. We drove away without discussing it. The trees closed behind us, swallowing the campsite completely. But the image remained clear in my mind. The stillness, the controlled movement, the certainty that someone had stood there, just beyond the light, close enough to see everything while remaining unseen. I arrived at the campsite just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long, stretching shadows across the forest floor. The air was damp from an afternoon rain, heavy with the smell of wet pine and earth. I carried only a small backpack with a tent, sleeping bag, and some food, planning a quiet night alone to clear my head. The path in had been narrow and overgrown, and I had almost missed the small clearing where I finally stopped. It wasn't a designated campground. There were no marked sites or signs, but the flat ground and sheltering trees seemed perfect. I set up the tent slowly, making sure the stakes were secure in the soft, muddy soil. The rain from earlier had pooled slightly in low spots, and I moved carefully around puddles as I arranged my gear. By the time I finished, the forest was dim, the light fading into a gray haze that made the trees look like tall, silent shadows. I lit a small camp stove to heat water for dinner. The hiss of boiling water and the smell of instant soup gave the clearing a temporary sense of warmth and comfort. But the damp air and the deepening darkness reminded me I was alone. After eating, I wrapped myself in the sleeping bag and sat just outside the tent, watching the forest. Every few minutes, a bird or small animal would rustle in the undergrowth. At first, it was calming, the sounds of life in the woods. But as night fell, the sounds changed. Twigs snapping underfoot and leaves brushing against each other became sharper, more deliberate. My pulse quickened as I realized some of the sounds were coming closer, moving around the edge of the clearing. I strained my eyes, but the darkness was thick. The trees were just black outlines against the faint starlight, and the forest floor was lost in shadows. I reminded myself that animals were probably responsible. Deer, raccoons, or maybe a stray coyote. I try to focus on the small comforts of the campfire glow and the feeling of the sleeping bag, but the noises persisted. One snap was louder, closer, and then I heard it, a soft, deliberate rustle of leaves that didn't match the randomness of natural movement. I froze, listening. The sound circled the clearing, slow and steady. My imagination tried to fill in the gaps, and I fought to ground myself in reason. Hours passed. The noises didn't stop. Every time I thought I could sleep, a crack of a branch or the scrape of underbrush drew my attention. I stayed alert, trying to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal. Yet nothing moved into the clearing, nothing I could see, only the persistent sounds that seemed just beyond vision. My fire had burned low, and the cold settled in. The forest was quiet for stretches, but then a faint, dragging sound came from the darkness, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. My stomach tightened, and I kept my hands close to the knife I had in my pack. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a branch falling, maybe an animal dragging food or sticks, but every sound felt intentional, precise, controlled. I could feel my heart in my throat, and I realized I had made a mistake coming alone. I had underestimated how vulnerable I felt in the dark when no one else was around. My sense of space narrowed, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, every flicker of movement amplified by my imagination. Eventually, I decided to leave the tent and walk the perimeter of the clearing with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted roots and puddles, but nothing moved. I walked slowly, circling the site, trying to find a clue to the sounds. It was empty, silent except for my own breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. When I returned to the tent, the noises stopped entirely. The silence was heavier than the sounds had been, and I realized my presence alone had been enough to disturb something, or at least convince me that it had. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting inside the tent, flashlight in hand, ears straining. Every distant sound made me tense, but nothing came closer. By dawn, the forest had changed. Light filtered through the trees, thin and pale, and the air smelled fresh after the night's chill. I packed quickly, eager to leave the clearing and reach a familiar trail. As I stepped onto the path, I looked back once at the dark, silent site. Nothing had followed me, no sign of any creature or threat, only the disturbed leaves and flattened grass where I had sat. The walk back was slow but steady. Sunlight brought clarity and warmth, and the forest lost its oppressive weight. By the time I reached my car, parked at the edge of a gravel lot, I was relieved. The experience had been disorienting, unnerving, and exhausting. Alone in the woods, every instinct magnified, every shadow a potential threat, I had learned how fragile my sense of safety could be. Later, I realized the truth of what had unsettled me. The forest itself was indifferent, and I had mistaken natural sounds for intent. My heightened awareness, fueled by isolation and fear, had turned ordinary movements into something menacing. There was nothing supernatural, nothing to chase me, only the natural world and my own mind reacting to it. I drove home slowly, tired but strangely clear-headed, aware now of how powerful solitude could be, and how carefully one must respect the unfamiliar rhythms of a place as alive and unassuming as the forest. I left the camp quietly, careful not to disturb the others who were still sitting around the fire. It was late, past 10, and the forest had settled into the kind of darkness that seems heavier than it should be. The glow of the fire behind me faded quickly, leaving only the narrow beam of my headlamp to guide my steps. I was walking to a small clearing I had scouted earlier to relieve myself, a place just far enough from the tents to give some privacy, but close enough that I could be back in minutes. The ground was soft under my boots, damp from the morning dew, and the scent of pine mixed with wet earth hung in the air, familiar and grounding. I had taken this trail before in daylight, so I knew the path. It twisted between thick trunks and over low roots, but at night everything seemed different. Shadows clung to every tree, stretching sideways and upward, and small sounds, The snap of a twig, the scuff of leaves, echoed louder than they should have. I reminded myself that I wasn't alone in the woods. There were always animals around, squirrels, raccoons, maybe even deer. I tried to focus on the rhythm of my own breathing, letting it steady me as I moved. The clearing came into view, and I took care to make the trip quick but deliberate, crouching behind a cluster of ferns. I was almost done when I heard the first faint sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the trail I had just walked. My chest tightened immediately, my stomach knotting. I froze, telling myself it was probably just the wind or a small animal. But the steps continued, precise, matching the rhythm of my own heartbeat. They stopped when I stopped. They started when I started again. I tried to convince myself it was someone else taking the same path back to their own site, but the synchronization was uncanny. I didn't turn around. My mind raced with possibilities, but every scenario I conjured felt wrong, impossible, or terrifying. I knew that in these situations, people say you should look, confront, or run, but every instinct screamed that turning around could make it worse. So I kept moving, each step deliberate, slow, trying to appear unhurried. My boots pressed against wet leaves, my hands brushed against branches, and still, the footsteps mirrored mine exactly. The night around me felt alive in a new way. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of damp moss and pine sap. A distant creek murmured over stones, a small sound that seemed both comforting and distant. Somewhere, an owl hooted, sharp and close, but it did little to ease the tension. I kept my gaze forward, my headlamp cutting a narrow path through the dark, illuminating nothing but the immediate trail. Every other sound seemed magnified, every rustle of leaf or crack of wood echoing like a signal. I tried slowing down, thinking that if I reduced my pace, I could gauge whether this was coincidence. The footsteps slowed. I sped up. They sped up. The realization made my stomach drop. This wasn't random. It wasn't a person at a distance. Someone was following me, precise, calculating, and patient. I forced myself to keep moving, careful not to make sudden movements that could reveal panic. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel the muscles in my back tensing as I imagined every possible scenario of what could be waiting behind me. I reached the end of the clearing where the trail turned back toward camp. My mind mapped the route in detail. The bend around the oak, the small ridge where the ground sloped down, the clump of brush that hid the path before it opened to the campsite. I knew if I could just make it past these landmarks, I could blend into the lights and noise of the others, and whatever was behind me would have to reveal itself or give up. The footsteps continued, never wavering, never breaking rhythm. My headlamp caught glimpses of shapes, nothing concrete, just the way shadows shifted when something moved, but every time I thought I saw someone, the movement aligned perfectly with my steps. My mind refused to give me clarity. I imagined a person crouched low, keeping pace, careful not to be seen. I imagined the worst, and yet, somehow, the fear was worse than any confrontation. Finally, the trail curved, and the glow of the campfire spilled into the darkness. I didn't break stride. I kept moving, letting the light grow behind me until the shapes of tents and sleeping bags came into view. The smell of smoke and wood warmed the air, and the soft laughter and quiet chatter of the group grounded me in a way the forest could not. I kept walking until I was near the perimeter of the firelight. Then, slowly, carefully, I glanced back. The trail behind me was empty. Nothing moved in the shadows. The synchronized steps, the invisible presence were gone. I exhaled without realizing I had been holding my breath, my legs trembling with relief and adrenaline. I returned to my tent, the sounds of the fire and friends now almost deafening in contrast to the stillness of the woods. I double-checked the tent flap, listened to the forest once more, and realized the footsteps had not been a trick of the wind, not an animal. Something had been there, following exactly, waiting, matching every step I took until I reached safety. I never told anyone the details at camp. I stayed up late that night, staring at the fire, retracing the path in my mind, wondering who or what had walked behind me and why it had never approached, why it had disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. It was a memory that clung to me, precise, silent, and utterly real, one that made even familiar woods feel like they belonged to someone else. I never walked that trail alone after dark again. It had taken effort to build it right. The wood around my campsite was damp from rain earlier in the day, and I had needed to split thicker pieces to reach the dry core. I started with bark shavings and a handful of dry pine needles from inside a fallen log. I stacked pencil-thin twigs over them, then thicker sticks in a loose cone. It caught slowly. I fed it carefully, watching the flame grow stronger without smothering it. By the time the sun had dropped behind the ridgeline, I had a steady fire that burned clean and hot. I kept it going for hours. It gave off steady heat and a quiet, steady sound. The air cooled quickly after dark. The forest around me, in Allegheny National Forest, turned black beyond the reach of the flames. I sat in my folding chair with my boots off, letting my socks dry near the fire. The smell of wood smoke settled into my clothes. Before going to sleep, I made sure to put the fire out properly. I had done this many times before. I spread the burning logs apart with a stick. I poured water from my bottle onto the coals until they hissed. Steam rose in thick white clouds. I stirred the ashes, making sure no glowing pieces remained buried underneath. I poured more water until everything was soaked. I pressed the wet ash with the end of a branch. It was cold and heavy. I did not leave any chance for it to restart on its own. I moved my chair back a few feet. I closed my cooler and left it beside the tree where I had set it earlier. I looked over everything once more before crawling into my tent. The ground around the pit was dark and wet. The fire was dead. I fell asleep quickly. I woke up with heat on my face. At first I did not open my eyes. My body was still heavy from sleep. The warmth felt real and close. It did not make sense. The night air had been cold when I went to bed. The tent had held that cold. I opened my eyes slowly. Orange light flickered across the inside of the tent. I froze. The fire was burning again. The shape of it was clear through the thin fabric. It was not glowing embers. It was a full flame. I could see the steady pulse of it. I did not move right away. My brain tried to make sense of it. I knew what I had done. I knew I had drowned the fire completely. I reached for my watch. The face glowed faintly when I turned it toward me. 2:17 a.m. I unzipped the tent slowly. The sound felt loud in the silence. Cool air slipped inside. The fire burned steady in the pit. Not just burning, but built. Fresh sticks had been placed over the coals. They were arranged in a loose, teepee shape. The ends of them were blackened, but the centers were still solid. Flames climbed up between them. I stared at it, trying to understand. I had not stacked wood like that before sleeping. I had taken it apart and drowned it. I pushed myself out of the tent. The air smelled strongly of smoke again. Not the damp, dying smell from before. This was active, fresh smoke. My chair was closer to the fire. I stopped walking. It had been several feet back when I went to sleep. I remember the exact angle. Now it's at only a foot from the fire pit, facing it directly. The legs had pressed new marks into the dirt. I turned slowly. My cooler was no longer beside the tree. It sat near the chair, closer to the fire. The lid was closed. The handle faced outward. I stepped closer and crouched beside it. I placed my hand on the lid. It was cold. I lifted it carefully. Everything inside was still there. Water bottles, wrapped food, nothing missing. I closed it again and stood up. The fire crackled quietly behind me. I looked down at the ground. The dirt around the fire was disturbed. Not heavily, but enough to see. The wet ash I had spread earlier was broken apart. Footprints overlapped each other. They were not mine. My boots were beside the tent. I wore only socks. These prints were deeper and sharper. The sole pattern was different, wider, heavier. I followed the marks with my eyes. They moved between the fire and the chair. They stopped near where the chair sat now. Someone had been sitting there. I felt a cold sensation spread through my chest. The sticks feeding the fire came from my pile of wood. I had stacked it beside a fallen log. Now several pieces were missing. I looked toward the trees. The forest stood silent. Tall trunks stretched upward into darkness. No movement, no sound. I listened carefully. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. No shifting branches. But the evidence was in front of me. Someone had been here, recently, close enough to move my things, close enough to rebuild my fire, close enough to sit and watch it burn. While I slept, I stood there for several minutes without moving. My eyes adjusted to the low light. Every shadow seemed sharper. I checked the ground again. The footprints led away from the fire. They moved toward the tree line behind my tent. I followed them slowly. They crossed through leaves and soft soil. The impressions became harder to see, but I could still track them by the disturbed ground. They disappeared into thicker brush. I stopped there. The darkness beyond that point felt deeper. My light was still inside the tent. I had nothing in my hands except the branch I had picked up earlier. I turned back. The fire burned steadily behind me. I did not put out again. I sat in the chair instead. The wood popped softly as it burned. I stayed awake the rest of the night. Every sound felt sharper. Small shifts in the trees, leaves falling, the distant crack of branches under their own weight. I kept watching the tree line. Nothing returned. By morning, the fire had burned itself down to ash. Sunlight reached the ground slowly, filtering through the branches. The forest looked normal again. Calm, empty, but the marks were still there. The footprints remained clear in the dirt. I examined them closely in daylight. The tread had a distinct pattern. Thick ridges with a rectangular shape in the center. Larger than my boots. I packed my gear carefully. I moved slower than usual. When I lifted my cooler, I noticed something underneath it. A small, crushed cigarette butt. I did not smoke. I picked it up. The filter was still slightly yellowed from recent use. It had not been there the day before. I placed it on the cooler lid and stared at it. Whoever had been there had stayed long enough to sit, smoke, and feed the fire. They had taken nothing. They had left nothing except that and the footprints. I loaded my gear in my car and drove out. Near the forest entrance, there was a small ranger station. It was closed, but a bulletin board stood outside under a wooden awning. I stopped and stepped out. Several notices were pinned there. Trail conditions, fire warnings, maps. One paper stood out. It showed a grainy photo from a trail camera. A man stood in the frame at night. He wore a dark jacket and carried a small pack. His face was partially turned away. Below the photo, printed text explained the situation. A transient individual had been moving through campsites in the area. He avoided direct contact. He used abandoned or unattended fires for warmth. He took nothing of value. He moved mostly at night. Visitors were advised to secure camps and report sightings. I stood there reading it twice. The date on the notice was recent. I looked down at the cigarette, but still in my hand. It matched. He had seen my camp. He had seen my fire. He had waited until I was asleep. Then he had rebuilt it for warmth. He had sat in my chair, close enough to hear me breathing inside the tent, close enough to reach out and touch it if he wanted. But he had taken nothing. He had left when he was done. I got back into my car and drove away. What stayed with me was not the fire itself. It was the fact that someone had been there in the dark, moving quietly through my camp, making himself comfortable beside me, existing only a few feet away while I slept without knowing. The fire had not come back on its own. Someone had needed it. And for a few hours in the middle of the night, my campsite had not belonged only to me. I reached the forest later than I had planned. The sun had already dropped behind the ridges, and the last light was draining out of the sky in thin gray layers. The road had turned to gravel miles earlier. It was a narrow logging road with no signs, no numbers, nothing to confirm where I was. I had turned off the highway because I wanted distance from everything. I had spent the past year in constant noise, constant pressure, and I wanted one night without hearing engines, voices, or anything man-made. The forest in that part of Oregon was thick with Douglas fir and western hemlock. The trunks stood straight and tall, packed tightly together. Their branches blocked most of the sky. Even before full dark, it felt dim under them. The air smelled damp and clean, with the sharp scent of sap and old needles covering the ground. I drove slowly, headlights sweeping across trunks and brush. My tires crunched over loose rock. Every turn felt like it led deeper into a place no one visited. After about 20 minutes, I found a small clearing beside the road. It looked like a turnout used years ago by logging trucks. Grass had grown through the dirt, and young saplings were starting to fill in the edges. I parked facing outward so I could leave easily in the morning. That was a habit I always followed. I turned off the engine, and the sudden silence pressed in around me. No distant traffic, no aircraft, nothing. I stepped out and stretched. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath faintly. It was early May, but the elevation made it feel closer to winter. The forest absorbed sound. Even my footsteps seemed quieter than normal. I didn't set up a tent. I slept in my car during trips like this. I folded the back seats down and laid out my sleeping bag. I ate a simple meal from a container I had packed earlier. I used a small flashlight to organize my things, careful not to waste the battery. By the time I finished, full dark had settled in. It was complete. No moonlight reached the ground through the trees. The forest became a wall of black in every direction. I stayed awake longer than I expected. I listened to the small noises outside, branches shifting, leaves moving slightly in the breeze. Once, something moved through brush somewhere off to my left. It sounded like an animal. It didn't approach. It passed through and disappeared. Eventually, I turned off my light and lay down. The car cooled quickly. Metal ticked as it contracted. I watched my own reflection faintly in the window. I don't know how much time passed before I woke again. I checked my phone. It was just after midnight. At first, I didn't know what woke me. I lay still and listened. The forest was quiet. Then I noticed something else. A feeling that didn't come from sound. It came from awareness. It felt like being watched. I stayed motionless. My breathing slowed. I stared out through the windshield. The darkness outside looked the same, dense and empty. I told myself it was nothing, just the mind reacting to isolation. Still, I reached for my flashlight. I opened the car door slowly and stepped out. The gravel shifted softly under my shoes. The cold hit harder now. I clicked the flashlight on and swept it across the clearing. The beam moved across grass, tree trunks, low brush. Then it stopped. I saw him standing between trees about 30 yards away. He wasn't moving. He stood upright, facing directly toward me. His arms hung at his sides. His posture was straight. He didn't lean on anything. The light hit his chest and face. He didn't react. He didn't blink. He didn't shield his eyes. He just stared. His clothes looked dark. A jacket and pants. Nothing reflective. Nothing bright. His face looked pale in the beam. His eyes reflected faintly, but not like an animal. It was dull, human. I froze. My mind tried to understand how long he had been there. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't heard brush moving. I hadn't heard anything at all. The forest was silent. I kept the flashlight on him, trying to see more detail. His expression didn't change. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't acknowledge the light. My hand started to shake slightly. I told myself he could be another camper, maybe someone walking through the forest. But he wasn't walking. He wasn't doing anything. He was just watching me. After several seconds, I turned off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed him instantly. I stood there, my eyes trying to adjust. My chest felt tight. I waited. Then I turned the light back on. He was closer, not by a step, by several yards. He now stood at the edge of the clearing. No footsteps, no sound, just closer. Every muscle in my body went rigid. He hadn't run. There was no way he could have moved that distance without noise. The ground was covered in dry needles and branches. But he had moved. He stood exactly the same way. Arms down, head facing forward, watching. I turned off the flashlight again. My breathing became shallow. I listened. Nothing. No movement. No shifting. No leaves disturbed. I turned the light on a second time. He was closer again, now less than 15 yards away. His face was clearer. His features were plain. No visible emotion. No anger. No confusion. Just focus. He stared directly at me. I realized he was moving only when I couldn't see him. He was advancing during the darkness. Slow. Silent. Controlled. My body reacted before my thoughts finished forming. I stepped backward toward my car. He didn't rush. He didn't react. He stayed still under the beam. I reached the driver's door, opened it, and got inside. I locked it immediately. My hands moved without hesitation. I kept the flashlight pointed at him through the windshield. He stood near the front of my car now, closer than 10 yards. He didn't touch the vehicle. He didn't wave. He didn't do anything except watch. I dropped the flashlight and started the engine. The sound broke the silence violently. He remained where he was. The headlights came on, illuminating him fully. He wore dark outdoor clothing, neutral colors, no markings, no reflective strips. He looked like someone who belonged in the forest, but he didn't move like someone who belonged near people. I put the car in reverse and backed up. Gravel sprayed under the tires. He stayed still. I turned the wheel and drove forward onto the road. As I passed him, I saw his head turn slightly, following me. His body stayed rooted. I accelerated faster than I should have on that narrow road. My eyes kept shifting to the mirrors. At one bend, I saw him again in the distance behind me. He stood in the road where my car had been. He watched until the trees blocked him from view. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. My hands shook on the steering wheel long after. I didn't sleep that night. Weeks later, I looked at maps of the area. I found the approximate road where I had turned off. It led deep into private timberland. Large sections were rarely visited. Not long after that, I saw a news report about law enforcement raids in forests across Oregon. They had found illegal marijuana grow operations hidden deep in remote timber areas. The report described armed guards stationed in the woods to watch for outsiders. Their job was to observe quietly, to avoid detection, to approach silently and assess whether someone was a threat. The article included photos of camps hidden under tree cover, tents, supplies, watch points positioned along access roads. One photo showed a guard standing between trees, wearing dark outdoor clothing, watching. The description explained their tactics. They stayed motionless when illuminated. They moved only when unseen. They used silence as control. They avoided confrontation unless necessary. I realized then exactly what had happened. I had driven into territory they were protecting. He hadn't spoken because he didn't want to reveal anything. He hadn't approached fully because he didn't need to. He only needed to make me leave. And it worked. I never went back.